2019 work session of the Williamsburg City Council will come to order. Ms. Burcham, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Maslin?
Here.
Ms. Ramsey?
Here.
Mayor Freiling?
Here.
Vice Mayor Pons? Here. Mr. Zhang?
Here.
On the agenda, we have items for the City Council meeting of May 9th, 2019. Mr. Trivett, is there anything you'd like to highlight?
A pretty decent selection of public hearings. We have one considering a rezoning and use of a property in the historic district. And then we have a couple of items dealing with food trucks for Summer Breeze and the permitting of Summer Breeze itself at the DeWitt Wallace lawn again. And then we have some housekeeping concerning the city code matching the state code as it relates to fees for restaurants and alcoholic beverage permits. We will hopefully be adopting the budget and looking at authorization for the EDA to pursue the Main Street Program affiliate status with the Department of Housing and Community Development of the state.
Any questions for Mr. Trivett? With that, I'll open the floor to public comment. Anybody here today who'd like to address council on any of the matters on the agenda for our Thursday meeting, you're welcome to come forward, please. State your name and address, and if you could keep your remarks to 5 minutes or less, we'd appreciate that. Welcome, Mr. Chauhan.
Thank you very much, Mayor. My name is Mickey Chauhan. I reside at 129 Berkeley Lane in the city. I was made aware that there was a proposal to amend the ordinance for tax on restaurants that serve alcoholic beverages. I'm not quite certain because what I received was just a little bit of a brief on what that was going to be about. I don't know when that is going to be worked upon or if that's going to be information shared by the city of what the tax collection will be, how many restaurants that will affect, what would be the overall dollar amount that would be received by the city. But I can tell you right now, the Restaurant Association and all the restaurants that would be affected by that would be strongly opposed to it on the surface. I hope that this council does not become a council that never met a tax that it didn't like, because I get that feeling and sense that that's the flavor of perhaps council. But I can tell you that those monies that are collected would come exactly from restaurant profits. It's not something that is borne by anybody else. It's not paid by the taxpayer. Also, I have to tell you the B-poll tax with just one of our restaurants is close to $5,000, and that's for the privilege of doing business in the city of Williamsburg. That does not take into account all the other taxes that we provide, from meal tax to sales tax. The amount of taxation that we collect and also provide to the city is unbelievable, and to find another reason to tax restaurants would place not an undue burden, but a burden that's unnecessary. So anyhow, I would be anxious to hear more information before council made a quick decision on what they plan to do, from just a suggestion to match other ordinance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chauhan. Mr. Trivett, would it be possible for staff to send some information to the Restaurant Association? I think that'd be a good way probably to get the word out among the membership of the restaurants. And if, Ms. Shelton, correct me if I'm mistaken, what we're going to be talking about on Thursday is not adding something to the city code. It's about the fact that it's in the city code and it may not have been uniformly enforced over the years?
That's correct with respect to restaurants. It does add the license fee to caterers. That's not currently in the code.
Okay, but we'll get that information out, and just because it's on the agenda this coming Thursday does not mean we have to necessarily act at that point.
That's
right.
correct.
I just might add,
Yeah.
you might consider hotels, because some hotels have restaurants that may not be members, and so.
The code doesn't affect them at all.
Doesn't.
There's no change with respect to them.
I thought I heard that we were already, they're paying a tax already.
They are.
They are. This won't change
Okay.
what they're doing.
So some already do pay what
Yes.
we're talking about.
Okay, anybody else like to address council? With that, we'll move on to our background presentations and discussion, the first of which is the presentation of the draft 2019 Economic Development Plan. Michele DeWitt, our Economic Development Director, and Crystal Morphis, Creative Economic Development Consulting. Welcome, Ms. DeWitt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. It's my pleasure to introduce Crystal Morphis to you. We've worked with Crystal, her team, with her economic development consulting firm on the economic development plan update this year. And I'll tell you a little bit about Crystal, and then a little bit about how we got to this point in the plan, and then Crystal will go into a highlight overview of the plan, as you've seen in your packet. So we're so pleased to work with Crystal. She has a wealth of experience both as a consultant and in the public sector. She was president of the Economic Development Corporation in Surrey County, North Carolina, and she spent 10 years with Sanford Holzhauser, a consulting firm, before starting her own firm. And we've thoroughly enjoyed working with Crystal and her team, very professional, and thank them. So how we got here, every 5 years, the city updates its comprehensive plan. And as part of that, we look at the economic development chapter of the plan and talk to the EDA and the public about what is the status of our economic development efforts in the city. This year, we looked at what targeted industries, and this is an economic development term. We say target industries, so for us that means what types of businesses will we be targeting to locate and to grow in Williamsburg. So we asked Crystal to look at that and reaffirm what we had been targeting, see if it still made sense. Do we still have the assets to attract those businesses? Are they still growth businesses that it would make sense to bring here? She did that analysis and then an action plan as a result of it. So last summer, Crystal and her team were in town and talked with businesses and stakeholders, held focus groups and one-on-one meetings with the stakeholders in the businesses and also with the EDA. In January, she came to a joint Planning Commission Economic Development Authority meeting, which was one of the comprehensive plan work sessions for the economic chapter, and presented the plan and had a lengthy discussion with the Planning Commission and the EDA about the plan. There was a public hearing. Nobody in the audience spoke, but the planning commissioners and the authority members had a robust conversation. So what she's presenting today is a result of all that effort, and I hope you enjoy it. Oh, one more thing I wanted to say, and she'll mention this, but 2 plans ago, when we did a strategic plan for economic development and looked at, it was the first time we had done anything like that in the city, we came up with 5 goals that made sense for the city. And each subsequent economic development plan has looked at those goals and reaffirmed them. And this is the same. We're still looking at existing businesses being our most important part of our effort. We want to diversify the economy while recognizing the strengths of tourism and education. We want to be known for a positive business environment. We want to keep our infrastructure at its high quality. We're known for that, and it's very important. And then lastly, we know we're no longer the only high-quality sense of place in the greater Williamsburg area where people shop and dine and spend their time, but we want to remain one of those places that people still spend their time. So this plan and the EDA reaffirmed these and then went into the targeted industry study.
Welcome, Ms. Morphis.
Thank you. I'm glad to be in Williamsburg. I look forward to answering your questions and having a discussion about the target industry validation and action plan. Michele did a great job to start with the why this is important as part of the comprehensive plan, and she mentioned the term target industries. And I just want to start there to make sure that we all have an understanding that in economic development, when you market to a target audience, just like in any other business, you have a target customer profile. That doesn't mean that Williamsburg would not welcome other business sectors to the community, but this is how you spend your marketing and external resource dollars to these industries. Now, when we say industries, it is a wide range of business sectors. We'll talk about that. And then the action plan focuses on those target sectors and how Williamsburg can be successful in attracting and retaining and growing those sectors, and it's really based on the value proposition. Michele did mention how this aligns with the biennial goals, initiatives, and outcomes. I'll just say a couple of comments about this. The first one's very important. Existing businesses typically represent somewhere around 80% of all a community's investment and job creation. So one of the things we did in the target industry validation was to look at the sectors that are already strong and growing in this economy and how could they be strengthened because of that high rate of investment and job creation from businesses that are already located in the community. A positive business environment is important. That's part of the competitive position analysis, and I'll mention a few of those highlights. And then Michele mentioned infrastructure and sense of place. One of the goals is to be a community of choice. Not only do businesses have a choice as to where to locate and grow, but people do too. And having that strong workforce base, that talent pipeline, as we say in economic development, is very important. A lot of work went into validating the target sectors, a lot of economic analysis that are in the appendices to the full report, which I'm sure you will all read every bit of the economic data that's in that report. But to summarize it, the target industry sectors, first and foremost, of course, is tourism and hospitality. It has been historically the strongest sector in this community and will be in the future. As we looked at in the report, we do outline specific competitive position advantages for each one of these. We can't overlook the near 8 million visitors annually, the 1.2 billion in visitor impact. All of that, plus the concentration of employment and businesses and establishments, go into that tourism and hospitality sector. The second is professional and technical services, and the state of Virginia is a leader in professional employment across the country. I think it's third in the country. And also business support services are similar to that, and it's a professional service sector. And the fourth one is health services. There are over 200 students graduating from William & Mary in the biological and biomedical sector. And in addition to that, the management students would support the business support services and professional and technical services. So we did look at the pipeline coming out of William & Mary to support the target sectors, each one of those. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We did spend quite a bit of time analyzing the value proposition. I'll touch on each one of these. Again, this value proposition supports the external marketing and outreach and recruitment for those sectors. First, it's very important to point out that you have a strong, growing population. This is very important. It shows that talent pipeline, that pipeline of workers for the future, and it's growing faster than the state. And this high percentage of millennials is important. They make up the largest percentage of the workforce, so showing that growth in the young worker is good. The labor shed is very strong and large, and you have a significant amount of out-commuters. That's actually an advantage because you can encourage them to then work locally. You can think of them as an available labor pool. In workforce skills, of course, because of your concentration of education assets here, you have above the national average in bachelor's degrees, graduate degrees, and also a really just high percentage of overall high school graduates in this community as well. Again, that's very important to attracting the types of, especially high-end service sector that we identified. I've mentioned the word talent pipeline a few times. We did look at the number of graduates coming out of William & Mary, as well as community college graduates in the area and the programs that they offer. Particularly, we were interested in the business administration and the healthcare related fields, since that supports the target sectors. We can't overlook the small business space and how important it is, especially in a tourism and hospitality economy. Many of the businesses are small businesses that feed into that. Here, 98% of your companies have less than 100 employees, and more than a third have less than 5. That less than 5 number is pretty high, and again, it represents the importance of small business in Williamsburg. And then we looked at transportation assets. Those are very important for especially the higher end service sector, as people need to have access to the airport and to larger markets and connect to them. So how does all this feed into goals and strategies relating to the competitive position and the target sectors? Each one of these goals and then the strategies have a depth of action steps underneath. I'll just hit on a few of these and be glad to answer more in-depth questions about it. The first one is about strengthening target markets. If you look at clusters in an economy, they really need 3 things to grow. One is a stable workforce with that talent pipeline. 2 is a strong supply chain network. And 3 are centers of innovation. So the first strategy is to bring those clusters together for networking, like in cluster coalition meetings, and provide some synergies, and also to work on that supply chain development so that they can connect and have all the resources they need. The second is innovation, centers of innovation for those clusters. You already have some, for example, for the service sector, the high-end service sector, but we've identified, for example, the need for tourism and hospitality and possibly retail innovation in the communities. Those are very two large segments of the economy and that could benefit from innovation centers. One of the reasons is oftentimes they have a high turnover rate in their business. They have a high failure rate, for example, and having a center of innovation and excellence that could help support them would help the Williamsburg economy be more stable. Second is aligning the talent development strategies with those clusters. The first one is to create career pathways so that young people can see a career pathway and training through a community college or one of the university and college assets in the region, so they can move into, for example, the tourism and hospitality industry or the healthcare industry, so they know the pathway they need to take. The second is to connect more of the college students to Williamsburg. One example, we suggested a how to start an internship program so more companies in the community can connect with students. Where students do internships, they are more likely to stay, and of course retaining those graduates is a key goal. The city's economic development department is already doing a good job at connecting the alumni and participating with alumni events, but really ramping that up and encouraging alumni to bring their business back to Williamsburg, for example, or to relocate here and become part of this talented workforce base. And then supporting trailing spouses. This is something that we've heard quite a bit. If you have a professional you've recruited to this community, supporting that trailing spouse with networking, information, welcome packets, helping them get connected and find employment here might help that family stick and stay in the city of Williamsburg rather than locating more in the region or not staying here long term. I mentioned marketing as a location choice. Both internally for business expansion and externally for new companies to come to the area. Your Economic Development Department works in partnership with the Greater Williamsburg Partnership and the state, of course, and other allies in external outreach. But there are several strategies and then action steps under these that include different strategies from marketing and outreach to recruit companies through lead generation, through e-marketing and other activities. But this section really focuses on external marketing strategies, but then internal as well to keep those existing businesses here and to keep them strong. This is choice business locations. Every business needs a home, and even though in economic development today the location choice is usually sealed by the workforce status of the workforce, what often first attracts a company to a community is real estate. Do they have available real estate? So we addressed several different types of real estate. We identified a gap in larger office space and in healthcare space in particular. I'll mention those. We don't want to first overlook co-work space and supporting the expansion of Work Nimbly and the new Launchpad location and how important that is to small business. But when I mentioned a gap in large office space, we do make some recommendations for ensuring the city has sites available for larger office space. We found a good inventory of small office space, but if you're going to go after and attract professional and technical services and business services, they may need much larger office space than what you currently have available. In tourism product, we make some recommendations for tourism development funding and how you can have space and sites available for tourism businesses. And in healthcare, we recommend working with healthcare partners to secure sites for future expansion and growth. We did not find a healthy inventory of sites already dedicated to healthcare. And then we do talk about, again, smaller businesses and an arts collaborative like an arts incubator or accelerator for the cultural arts activity in the city, and also possibly a retail incubator, which would provide more stability to retail businesses as they start up. And again, focusing on small business and entrepreneurs, we talk about in the report how it can be easier to open a business in Williamsburg. Your Economic Development Department does a very good job at working with potential business startups and small business expansions. but promoting them as a concierge service or as a key business liaison so that companies know that's the department to contact, and they can help them navigate the regulatory process and make it easier for them. We also suggest things like starter kits, how to start a business in Williamsburg. The website has some good information on it right now. These would just be some enhancements. And then placing some focus on women, minority, and young entrepreneurs. Those groups are starting businesses at faster rates than your historic entrepreneurs. And you already have partnerships like with the Virginia Department of Small Business and Supplier Development, and also the Small Business Development Center, but leaning more on them to make sure that you have a partnership for small business development, particularly in those areas. Incentive policy, we did look at incentives and incentive policy and how that affects Williamsburg competitiveness. We just have a few recommendations. With office projects, they are not capital intensive. We find this not just from Virginia, but other places. Sometimes the incentive policy does not address the indirect and induced impacts from the higher wages at those operations. We recommend you considering some other impacts other than traditional capital impacts. The incentive policy may not address large tourism projects, for example, some that could be attracted as a destination to the area. And then we do recommend considering a health services zone, like a tourism zone, which would address the healthcare cluster. And finally, we make some suggestions about resources for implementation. For example, you have a very small staff in the Economic Development Department, and they have a large program of work. Over time, that staff will come to you for resource requests for implementation of this study, as well as the other goals and initiatives that they have. So we just want you to be mindful of the resource that may be requested in the future for implementation. And I've said a lot of things that fall into this plan. We did divvy it up between multiple years and some ongoing initiatives so that that staff, which again is a very small staff, can focus on a few things each year over multiple years for implementation. And I will say in closing that the staff has been excellent to work with, also the EDA board. The community leaders and business leaders that we engaged with throughout this process were very complimentary and passionate about this community. It was very exciting to me to see the level of business leadership that are committed to this location and committed to economic growth in Williamsburg. So it's been a very good project, very, very good people to work with throughout this project. So with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ms. Morphis. I appreciate you coming in. The work that you all have done on this is obviously very comprehensive. There's certainly a lot of information. I was reading through the full report the other day, and a lot of good stuff. You know, when you talk about business and business incubation, business generation, what we do as business people is look at some of the weaknesses and threats of the area. Was any of that type of thought put into this report so that I know we talk about some of the target sectors and how they may be bended, but you know, when you talk about labor, one of the things I hear from people all the time is there's not enough labor. And so there's a little bit of a conflict there. And so I'm curious about that, because I think that's more of a threat than really as an opportunity that we have today. So maybe you can speak.
Sure, sure. And we do a lot of full strategic planning. And in full strategic planning, we do a really deep dive in a SWOT analysis, which are the weaknesses and threats you mentioned. This was more focused on the target sectors and the competitive position. But of course, we had to look at weaknesses and threats as part of that. So, for example, one of the gaps that we identified, you can call it a weakness, is in like large office properties, for example, which would be needed for that growing target. So we identified that. You particularly mentioned the workforce. There is low unemployment pretty much everywhere. There is a workforce shortage, and we'll be facing that for at least the next 15 to 20 years. Some may say longer than that. It is a real challenge. However, your state, and particularly this region, has shown that it is attractive to particularly those professional and business services, and so you have lots of people moving to this area for those jobs, and you've got those over 10,000 people now that out-commute, which could be attracted to a job here. So yes, you're right, the low unemployment is a threat, but at the same time, we do see this pool of available workers for Williamsburg in the future.
And I guess related to labor, is housing and.
That's
do have a
right.
Short of housing, to support some of these.
That was one of the, probably the most discussed topic at the Joint EDA and Planning Commission back in January when I was here, was housing. And in fact, probably 4 or 5 years ago, housing was rarely mentioned when I did work in communities, but now housing is mentioned in every community. Anything from workforce or affordable housing to executive housing to young professional multifamily, it's just a wide range. We talked quite a bit about that, and housing is very important, and in communities it takes a different shape. We're even seeing some communities get engaged in public participation in encouraging specific housing, especially in redevelopment areas.
One of the things you mentioned that piqued my interest, we have had a lot of conversation and made some effort towards tourism development with, 0.5% coming in now to support projects. And we have tourism zones, but you mentioned incentivizing healthcare in zones. Is there a designation out there that helps that industry? For example, we have Riverside in the city, and around it is lots of acreage, which would be a great place for office parks and medical-related services. Is there zoning designation that healthcare industry could benefit from?
That, I'll probably have your planning director answer if there's a specific designation in Virginia. I know that in other places, they do establish zones in which they do offer some tax benefits to for-profit health care. Of course, a lot of health care is nonprofit, but to for-profit health care and other types of incentives. One of the things that we do recommend, particularly with health care, and this can even be nonprofit, is to ensure they have property available. So in that area of health care, to ensure that you have property that is designated for the healthcare industry, the medical industry, so that they have a place to locate and grow. And you would even encourage some of your existing healthcare related businesses to go in and start securing property for expansion in the future.
So the only other point I would make in reading through the report, looking at some of the revenue numbers that were presented, and I think you probably got those numbers from the state, which are always inflated and not really based in reality. And one of the numbers that struck me was saying that Williamsburg has a 66% occupancy rate, which is not true. So might do some cleanup on that.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we did get, especially the state figures, we got from state tourism offices, yes.
They like to think they're doing a better
Better
job
than
than
they
they
are.
are. So
Thank you for that.
Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for being here, for presenting. As I read your 53-page report, I couldn't help but feel kind of like a wave of excitement reading through the pages, just the potential that the city has. And in reading the 2012 Economic Strategic Plan, we've come a long way. But it seems like a lot of the major areas we're talking about with target cluster development and business development with those target sectors, we're still talking about some of the similar themes, and I know it's drawn out, through years. It's not like city council passes a policy today and tomorrow we'll reap the benefits, but it's a long-term process. But it's great to see that some of the themes that's reaffirmed, and also some new ideas that's been thrown out. So I appreciate it. I saw the videos you had recommended. There was one from a county that talked about jobs with the younger kids and the older folks that are working around town. I thought those were Henderson County, I think. But I thought those were great ideas. So I have some broad questions, and then I may be nitpicking a little bit from some parts of the report. So generally speaking, we see some of the more successful tourism cities like Asheville. You got the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, and I think it's safe to say they've done a great job kind of developing their target sectors. And I think a lot of localities look to them as prime examples of what can be done. So here in the city, we are landlocked. We're kind of going back to the risk assessment for new businesses. It's not really much land to develop. We are very much a redevelopment city. So how do we really grow and expand on some of these target sectors when it's landlocked, and sometimes folks look for that land? And we are mired in, or I guess we're rooted in, the tourism sector. So what are some best practices that other successful localities have done to basically kind of reimagine it or expand on these target sectors?
You mentioned Asheville, and that would be a good example. They have a focus on redevelopment, which you would need to have here in Williamsburg.
Okay.
And they really have been a leader in public-private partnership projects and development, where the city has been an active participant and encourager in private redevelopment in part of the city. They also created, I think it's 3, what they call innovation districts, in which the city drives investment in redevelopment in innovation districts through city policy as well as city incentives. But that's what we've seen as a best practice, is identifying areas for redevelopment and properties that are underutilized or vacant. In some cities like Columbia, South Carolina, there's actually a vacant building reutilization grant program that focus on redevelopment.
So with these localities that were pushing these new programs and developing these target sectors, was there anything, a particular asset or trait that made them more successful? Did they take a more holistic approach, like looking to workforce housing, providing that supply, designating land use like tourism zones for that particular business that helped them grow? Or, was there really one key to success in your experience?
So targeting and target analysis, it's really an analysis of the assets you have today with the clusters that are expected to grow in the future.
Okay.
So for example, you may have had a strong cluster or an emerging cluster, but it's not really expected to grow. And again, because this report focuses on your external marketing and outreach, so a lot of that asset base and that expected growth is related to workforce, and especially in professional and technical services and business services and healthcare, there's a lot of projected future growth in those sectors, and particularly the professional and business services. Your state, and in this region in particular, is excelling at those. So there's projected growth, you have a strong talent pipeline that really settles in. Tourism and hospitality is such a cornerstone, and even as the tourism industry grows, you're going to continue to get a large part of that market. So that's what really fed into those.
Right, thank you, and I appreciate that you had mentioned. I was a little worried before reading the report. I guess you shouldn't be making assumptions until after reading that there wasn't going to be anything mentioned on businesses started by people of color and also by women, and with particular regards to small business development in general too. So I appreciate that you had mentioned something on that. I think that's also really important. Oftentimes we talk, broad strokes about economic development, but we don't necessarily, focus on the other themes as well. Now, I know we have the chamber here. We have a really robust career center in the college, law school, because I'm a law student, I only know that. We have also really robust career services that collaborate a lot with local businesses. So when you give, for example, a recommendation about starting the internship kits, do those, in your experience, find that they compete with the city? So folks might not necessarily refer to the city information anyways, and therefore, is it redundant, or is the redundancy a helpful thing? That's a really narrow example, but
Sure. So the city and your city staff would interact with businesses. Some would be the same that these centers would interact with. Some may be different. So if there was a uniform effort, not only of your office but its partners, to encourage more businesses in Williamsburg to offer internships to students, then you can coordinate that, because your office in the city would outreach to some different folks than what would be outreach to by the others.
And this is the final question. This may be a little bit more specific, but with Chamber of Commerce's, here we have a unique entity where we have joint organizations with the tourism side that does that funnels public money for marketing purposes, and then we have our business council, which is viewed more as the traditional, Chamber of Commerce. In your experience, what kind of role can the chamber play as well to help with these efforts?
So just one off the top of my head, chambers do a really good job with YP networks. We've seen them do a great job. And I mentioned how important talent and workforce and connecting young people to the economy. We use the term making your city sticky for young people. And that's just one way that I think chambers can do a good job, is with something like a young professionals network. And there are many others, but that's just one idea.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I saw it in January and appreciate you being back here for it. And I don't have any specific questions, just a couple comments as someone who graduated from William & Mary, stayed in town, as did Benny and Paul. And I think that we still have the challenge of changing sort of the mindset of Williamsburg for William and Mary grads, and I'm not exactly sure how we do that. I think that even still, if you stay in town, it's because you don't have options elsewhere, or it's perceived that way, as opposed to oftentimes a choice. In talking to students over the past few weeks of what they're planning on doing, I would say 8 out of 10 of them are going to either Washington or New York and work with consulting firms. Now, that may be in healthcare, it might be in business services, but they're going to the big firms that can provide a lot of intensive training, travel, and a different lifestyle than Williamsburg. And so I think that it's somewhat of a challenge of how do we, part of our recreation of the Williamsburg brand, but to the students. But then I find that those who have been out for a while and then come back appreciate the opportunities that are here. I was talking to someone just last week who came back, but if he hadn't left, he probably wouldn't have had the means to come back and start a business and be as successful as he was. And he said that being in Williamsburg, you're it's a lot easier to be involved and engaged in the community. And so I think we need to look at how we tell our story. And one of the big challenges we're going to continue to have is our critical mass compared to a lot of places. And so just, to think about that. And also, I think that we should also look a little broader than just William and Mary. Christopher Newport's down the road, and for students who, grown up and gone away to school and then come back, look at Williamsburg a little differently as well. So
just what you mentioned is how some economic development organizations are addressing the talent pipeline. Many that I've talked to are not trying to recruit the 23, 24-year-old. They're trying to recruit the 30-year-old.
Right.
And so that's why the engagement with the alumni network is so very important. Some communities have said, well, the 23 or 24-year-old needs to go off for a while. Then, like you said, they appreciate this place here.
Thanks. Well, I echo some of Barbara's comments, though I actually did move here as a young professional after the University of Virginia, but then got my master's here and was recruited to the West Coast. So then I came back understanding the value of community here. On the talent pipeline, one of the drawbacks I think we have is we don't have an engineering school. And I know the college is working in terms of expanding their physics program to maybe get into that area. Have you had any discussions with them in terms of where they're going and maybe where Thomas Nelson is going in terms of more technical training?
We did not, but that is, during this study is when Amazon made its announcement and Virginia Tech made its announcement about its investment in the Northern Virginia area, and that is an emerging opportunity that I think does need to be explored. It's an example of how this needs to be a dynamic document going forward, because this whole area of Virginia is going to have an influx of investment and talented people and an interest from educational institutions in this whole general area.
Thank you.
Ms. Morphis, thank you very much for your presentation. One thing I'd like to ask staff to consider, and they're probably already thinking about this, is looking at the implementation slide, the one that's still on the screen, the last one on your presentation, maybe even breaking it out a little bit more and then using that as a dashboard to report each year on what's the progress of the plan and how is it evolving? Because as you said, it's a dynamic document. The implementation plan as we see it right here will probably not look like this in year 3 because some circumstances will have changed, but at least having a framework within which we can measure the progress would be very helpful. And one other point, and again, I'm sure Ms. DeWitt is already thinking about this, but you mentioned in years 4 and 5 the creation of how to start an internship brochure. Seems like a great topic for an economic development authority or business roundtable, where we bring in folks from the college and not just wait for that brochure to be created, but lay the groundwork for businesses to start thinking about the untapped talent that currently is enrolled at the college and how to take advantage of that, and thereby hopefully helping some of them realize the potential to stay and contribute long-term to the community. So council will be considering this report for adoption at our Thursday meeting, and it has already been adopted by the EDA.
Recommended that you adopt it, yes.
Okay. Thank you
It
very
sounds like
much.
we'll correct the occupancy rate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our second background presentation today is concerning the 2020 census and Williamsburg's low-response census blocks. With us today, we have Raquel Cepeda, Kevin Krigsvold, and Colin Louis, or is it Lewis? Lewis, and partnership specialist with the U.S. Census Bureau, but I'll ask Mr. Trivett to kick this off.
Sure. You know, as we march closer and closer to the kickoff of the 2020 census, the Census Bureau is becoming more and more engaged in trying to amp up awareness and generate better response rates. So earlier, I had the opportunity to meet with the Census Bureau and discuss ways in which we could impact participation inside the city, particularly in a couple of census blocks where our participation rate's a little lower than the rest of the city, just slightly less than 25%, which is already a pretty high rate of response. And so these kind of folks from the Census Bureau asked if they could come speak to the council to help generate further awareness and make a plea for a complete count committee to be formed.
Great.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the mayor, to the city council, to the city manager, city attorney, and everyone that's here in attendance. My name is Colin Lewis from the Census Bureau. I'm a partnership specialist. I have in the audience also a couple colleagues, Raquel Cepeda and Kevin Krigsvold. I won't be before you long. I've learned a long time ago that good presentations mean the first slide and the last slide are close together, but very informative, okay? So, again, what we want to talk to you today about mostly is a complete count committee for the city of Williamsburg. I'll start by saying the reason why we have the U.S. Census is because it was a mandate, Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. It's a great a portion of seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. But the big thing for Williamsburg that we want to highlight is the $675 billion federal dollars to state and local governments. That's real, actual money that can come back to the city to do a lot of what you were just discussing. A lot of it is not returning to the city because we don't have enough participation rate, as the city manager mentioned. In some of those areas, we have those low response rates. And it's also for those that have small businesses or nonprofits who submit for grant information. A lot of that data is coming from the Census Bureau. And so I tell a lot of nonprofits that sometimes the dollars that you're seeking, you're not receiving because the census data just doesn't support it. This is a very busy slide, but it just talks about 50 ways that the census data is used. In essence, it's used for all of your SNAP programs, your free and reduced lunch for schools, for your roles. We talked about infrastructure just shortly ago. All of those areas, the census helps you in regards to ways that you can use the data. 2020 will be different, a little different than the census in the past. Everyone here probably has had the opportunity to receive the form in the mail and you fill it out. This coming year, what we're trying to do is become more of a digital way of doing it. So sometime around March, people will begin to receive information in the mail. On that information, it will have a URL that they can easily go to an internet website. You can do it over a smartphone, and it's going to go to a dwelling place, not to an individual. And what will happen, it helps us to establish where we're going to count. From there, where we are now, we're in the educational phase, which is why we're here to help people to understand and motivate people to respond. You're not the only city that has some areas that have some low response rates. Although yours may not be as high as others, we want to get you guys as close to 100% as we can. So we do a lot of the heavy lifting. We just need your help and support on the outreach and getting the message out. So after we motivate the people, we begin around April 1st next year, 2020, counting the population. So it's important that we identify those low response areas because, like you, other cities have areas, military, colleges, things of that nature that are in the past traditionally hard to count areas because do you count the kid that's from Charlottesville who came to William and Mary here or does he count at home? We always say that on April 1st, 2020, wherever you're laying your head that night is where you're going to be counted. Because one thing about your college students, they are using your roads, they are using your schools and everything else in the area. So regardless of where they're at, if they live in the city of Williamsburg, we want to count them here so that you guys can get that money back, okay? December 31st, 2020 is when the results will hit the president's desk, and then it'll start being disseminated out amongst the population. But we want to make sure that we count everyone once and only once and in the right place. And so we'll do all the heavy lifting. We just need your support and your help to help us, not just in those low response areas, but in all the areas of Williamsburg. So this is just an environment, the census environment. You look at the circles around, we talk about the declining response rate, increasingly diverse population, a mobile population. We're not dealing with, you know, we joke and laugh like my mom does not have the internet and there's no way I can convince her to get it. So she's going to be a mail order person, but we want those who are mobile, who will have access to the internet to use it that way because it'll be a lot easier and quicker to count people, okay? So this is what we have, and you can easily access this, every person in this room. It's called Rome Data, and what it does is it essentially just highlights the city of Williamsburg, and it'll tell you the different tracks. And so you have 3 tracks. 2 of your census tracks have the response rate between 20 to 24.9%. These are of concern due to predicted responses. So we can't tell you right now today that those same areas will be low response, but we can say from past data, these areas were low to respond to the census. And so I want to highlight this part. We talked about the $675 billion that was allocated back to the states. On average, we're projecting for every one person who does not fill out their census form, the city of Williamsburg loses approximately $2,000 per person. So if you do that times 1,000 people over a 10-year period, that's millions of dollars that's not coming back to the city. And that's something that we can easily go back to get. It's not something that you have to do anything special or extra for. It's just a matter of someone filling out the census data. So if you look, and we can certainly get you this information track by track, if you look here, you can see that it is predicted that 24.2% of the population in this particular track, which is 3703, about 7,200 people, will not respond to the census mail form. That's a lot of money that's not going to return to the city of Williamsburg that I'm sure you could use to do much and greater things with. So we call them low response scores. If you look at track 3701, it tells you have about 18.7%, which is moderately low compared to some of the other municipalities we've gone to. But we'd like that number to be lower than that. We'd like for you to be, my goal is 100%. I know we probably won't get 100%, but I'm a high achiever. But even if we can get that under 10%, that would be great. But when you go into Rome, if you look at it, it tells you about the total population of the area. It tells you about what the median household income is, the population under 5. So it breaks down all the demographics as well, which will help you if you form a complete count committee. It'll help you to determine who should be a part of that so that you can send the right people to the right locations. Here's just another tract, 3702. This one is a little higher, it's closer to 25%. Again, it shows you a lot of the data. This is 3703, it's a lot of the similar information. One thing I want to make sure that as we go out and we share with people about the census, everyone has a concern. We live in a society now that may have a little distrust with the government. We will not share any information with anyone, whether it be ICE, whether it be the Housing Authority, any of the other alphabets of the government. Our confidentiality and privacy does not permit it. We've all taken an oath that says that we will not share or disseminate that information with anyone for any reason. Not even the president can get this information. One of the big components of another reason why, just as a stickler, not just because we're good people and we're honest, but there's also the potential of a fine of up to $250,000 should we share it, and there's up to 5 years in prison. So no court of law can have access to the individual census responses, And so we want to help, get that information out, because I believe personally that's one of the main reasons why we have such low response scores. People aren't confident that their information won't be shared. So we want to make sure that we dispel any rumors, any myths, any questions that they may have. So what is a complete count committee? The Census Bureau is asking the government organizations to set up a complete count committee if feasible. It's really just a representation. It's almost like a city council, if you would, of individuals throughout Williamsburg who have influence in their particular areas. So if you look in certain areas where they have low responses, there's someone there, whether it be a pastor, a business owner, a community leader who has influence. Putting them on a complete count committee could really help you to find those areas and be able to have a voice that someone can trust. That's really what we're going for when we do a complete count committee. So they play a major role in conducting census outreach and promotion activities for the community. So forming these, we've seen in the past, has helped us to increase the response rate for residents returning their questionnaire through focused neighbor-to-neighbor programs. So I think that Williamsburg is a perfect place to do one, because you have just 3 tracks that, they're not quite as high as some of the other municipalities, and it shouldn't be as hard to get them back in under the 10% range. This is just a sample of what a complete count committee would look like. No one on this board has to be there. These, again, is just a sample. But if you can see, it has the head of the public school system. One of our major concerns right now, is children under the age of 5 not being counted. And so that's why we suggest someone from the public school systems, because I don't know if you guys remember when we used to have the seatbelt drive, and they got it out to the children, and the children would get in the car with their parents and say, "Mom, you got to put your seatbelt on." After a while, that kind of stuck. You get tired of hearing your child in the back seat say, "We can't pull off until you put on your seatbelt." We want to kind of have that same kind of impact on parents to make sure that we're counting the school children. So one of the great assets that you'll have is that the state has a complete count committee. They have a website. They have a lot of information. They've already set up several meetings. I think they've been meeting since probably around October. So there are a lot of information that you can gain and glean from, so you don't have to start the wheel moving on your own. As you can see, there's others on here as well, heads of large universities and colleges, so William and Mary would certainly be one of those. Some have what we call subcommittees, because you can't do all the lifting on your own. That's Richmond, I'm so sorry. But they have subcommittees. So if you look, you can find someone in the business area, you can find someone in the community organizations, you can find someone in education. They would essentially report back to you. And I'm not sure of your veteran presence here, but I'm sure, like every other municipality here, there's a lot of veterans that are here, and you may be able to find a liaison that can help you with your veteran population. So the goal is the outreach and promotion is to develop community support and increase participation by 2020. Self-response is really the key in the goal. We want people to self-respond. We don't want to have to send out enumerators. We don't want people having to knock on the doors. Hopefully we can, in that first wave, we can get people to actually self-respond so that we can eliminate that. Here's the timeline. So you can see we're past the fall of 18. Recruitment begins for early census operations. We're moving into the peak of our operations for 2020. Between August and October, our in-field address canvassings where needed will begin. Between March and July, we're going to hopefully start in March. We'll send out the URLs for people to be able to log in. April 1st, we'll begin the actual census. We'll collect those data up until July 2020. Then we'll be also doing some in-person and follow-up interviews. And March to September, we'll also have, one thing that I want to mention also is that for someone who may not have access to the internet, they will be able to have an 800 number that they can call. We have currently about 13 languages that they can call in, and someone will actually fill out the form for them in those 13 different languages. So we're looking at innovative ways to get people to respond, and not just through the paper form. So respondents will be able to respond via the internet, telephone, or the paper questionnaire. December 2020, all the data will be delivered to the president, and in March of 2021, that information delivers redistricting data to the states. So we have here in Virginia a few area census offices. The one, Fairfax, just recently opened. They're looking to open these other 4 or 5 by October. As you can see, Virginia Beach will have one. That'll probably be, I'm not sure how that will, because you're probably closer to Richmond, but either way, you could have an area census office to support you in either of those cities. One thing also we would like to mention is that nationwide, the Census Bureau is looking to hire up to 500,000 people. That wave is beginning now, so if you know of anyone that's looking for part-time employment, full-time employment, these are just some of the many jobs that we have available at our census offices. So in case someone may not want to drive all the way to Virginia Beach or go up to Richmond for these type of jobs, we also have what we call field jobs. These are just some of the pay tables we say anywhere between 12 and 20 for a lot of our field jobs. We don't hold fast to that because it really depends on the city, locality that you're applying and you're going to be working. But as you can see, June 2019 is only a few weeks away, and we're looking to begin hiring in all of those areas. Here's a few websites in case you have some questions you'd like to go and find out. You can go to census.gov. For those looking for jobs, we have actually 2 places to go. You can also go to USA Jobs, or you can go to the 2020 Census Jobs /jobs. The response outreach area mapper that I mentioned earlier that actually shows you those tracks is Rome. Here's a link to that if you want to go out there and look, and it gives you a lot more data than that. We just condensed it for the purpose of the slides. If you guys have any questions at all, I'll take those at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis, for coming. First, a shout out to your mom for not getting the internet. It just complicates your life.
Yes.
So I would imagine communicating with the public has got to be much easier today with social media and all that's available today that wasn't 10 years ago. And I know that the city has a communication staff that has a robust email account and social media following, and I'm pretty sure that they would probably be very willing to step in and help. But thank you for coming with this information. I think it's valuable, and I've learned something today that there's benefit to filling it out, and it's just not government trying to figure out who you are and where you are. So,
Sir. And that's been the biggest misnomer that we've known, is that people think it's a way to try to track you and figure out who you are, where you're staying, what you're doing. But it's really a way to help each state, each city to do better things for roads, for schools, for things of that nature. And once I found that out, that's really why I took the position, because I know that it helps, especially those areas in which I serve and help and do other things that I realize are maybe not receiving the funding that they could be. And a lot of it is because they have those low responses.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis, for being here today. And to echo what the Vice Mayor had said, I learned something today that it serves a very crucial role, and oftentimes, even before your presentation today, I would have known of any of this. So I hope the city staff can find some way to call that message as well. It's not just something that we have to do every 10 years. It has a lot of consequences for all levels of government, including here, where we're at the ground level. In terms of your experience for the count committee, for smaller cities, I understand with the slide, you kind of gave a sample with all the subcommittees, and I can see how that can work with large city organizations like Philadelphia, maybe even Richmond, but New York City. For smaller cities, what are some of the best practices that you've had or that you can recommend to us for the count committee?
For the complete count committee, essentially, you want those that are connected to the government, because you guys are making the decision, so you would like some type of representation from that. But really and truly what we're looking to do, because we're trying to aim our focus at those low response areas, is find those people that are in those areas that can go out and become that trusted voice to say to someone, hey, we're not collecting the data to send to ICE, we're not collecting the data to send to the Housing Authority. So we've seen everyone from nonprofits to pastors to even school teachers. We've even seen residents of housing low-income housing a part of a complete count committee.
Yeah, and I think most cities, every city is different. I think for us, we're so unique in that our city staff is so closely related to the
Yes.
people here, which is a great thing. I think speaks a lot to the quality of services we give. My thought process is, it seems based on your answer that a third party, nonprofit, the ones that are really on the grounds working particular issues will be able to communicate, maybe not necessarily just city staff too.
Yes.
So it's about activating those nodes. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you for the presentation, and like my colleagues, I learned something today, and since they have made such informative, or asked the right questions, I don't have anything else to ask at this time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, as a William Mary student, I was actually a census taker, and I don't remember if that application had a recall provision. But a couple questions. I would think there could be potential for ID fraud. How do people actually know that the site they're going to is the site that is, official? And how do you, is there an independent verification for that? It's easy to send a letter and say, okay, go into this site, and we want your census information.
I don't want to misspeak, but one thing for certain is that if you go to the .gov, the government site is secure. It has all of the securities of any other government site. We have a lot of questions that come about fraud, about identity fraud. So I think that's another reason why they've given us these badges and other credentials to show that we're legitimate. And so when someone comes out if someone were to come to someone's home as an individual, they could call someone to verify that that person is a part of the census. Kevin, do you have any insight, you or Raquel, about how we can prevent the fraud portion of the first set of mailings that'll go out with the URL?
From the official government. Highway compliant. We're doing our best to make sure.
So there could be official-looking emails out there too. How are you going to be telling the community not to, click on any emails that look like they're coming from you?
It's coming in the mail.
Yeah, so one thing is they shouldn't receive any kind of email. So anything that's email is not from us.
And I know that, but how do you communicate to the community that?
So that's a part of our complete count committee. When we get our people together, we'll be going out and spreading that word. We also have people working in your community now, which are field representatives that are helping us get that message out. So our job is to partner with not just municipalities, but with other businesses, with other localities. We partner with libraries and things of that where people may go to actually do the survey. And so we're giving them a lot of the fore information so that they know beforehand not to take an email. If you do receive a phone call, you don't have to answer anything on that phone call. So we're trying to get out in front of this now to avoid some of that. There's no way to fail-proof it, I'm sure, because you'll have some, like my mom, who will get it and she'll call me and ask, is this legit? Not everyone will. And so that's why our hope is to get out as early as we are now, to get that information out, to say you shouldn't be receiving an email from the census. No one will come and knock on your door initially. The only way we're going to come and knock on the door is if your URL hasn't been completed in the beginning stages and your dwelling place has been identified as not responding. So the initial one will just be the URL. It will be an official government site. So that's what we need your help with, is making sure that those areas in your community are getting that information now and early and often, so that when that time comes, they feel more comfortable.
Following up on Benny's best practices question, what about the role of the libraries and the schools? How does that help you?
It helps tremendously, because a lot of cities, there are areas and pockets in areas that may not have the internet access easily available at home. And so we're asking them to allow us to use their facility to be able to have patrons come and use. Schools, the biggest reason for that is we have a high population of children under the age of 5 that's not being counted. And although it may not seem like a big deal now, in 10 years, some of those children will be teenagers. It's hard to believe, but in 10 years when we do the census again, they'll be teenagers. And so you don't want to miss out on the money that's available by counting everyone. And so that's the reason why we're asking for schools, libraries, small businesses, nonprofits and things of that nature to get involved as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Lewis, thank you very much. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate all the information. Most importantly, we appreciate all that you and everybody else is doing to get this data. I cannot imagine how one begins a process as enormous as this with all the legwork involved. So the community outreach element is important. I do have one thought to share with Mr. Trivett. At some point, it might be worthwhile talking to the Neighborhood Council of Williamsburg and maybe having this part of a news brief. It may not be a full presentation, but a city staff member coming in and talking to that group where we have representatives from many neighborhoods and getting their help in getting the word out could be useful.
I think that's a good idea.
Thank you, sir.
No problem. And one last thing, these are all of the ways through social media. Someone mentioned social media earlier, and that is the way that a lot of our children and people are going today. Here's a few sites and links that you can follow us on. So we've tried to cover every possible social media platform. It has a lot of information. We'll answer a lot of questions. The city manager has our information as well. So if there's something that you forgot to ask or didn't come to mind just yet, he has our information. Please don't hesitate. Any myth, any rumor, any question is not silly to us. Please get it to us. We can get you the best answer, because that is one of the absolute best ways to make sure that people are fully engaged, is that they fully are informed. All right?
Great. Thank you, sir. This takes us to our city council communications. Do any council members have anything they'd like to share? Mr. Zhang?
I'll be quick. This is not necessarily with liaison position with one of our organizations, but this is, since the city is a member of the Virginia Municipal League, I just wanted to let everyone know I was appointed the vice chair of its legislative committee, which considers the legislative program to the General Assembly. And just to note, the city overlaps some of our initiatives with our legislative agenda with theirs. So,
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Schedule of meetings, Mr. Trivett, anything you'd like to highlight for this month?
Obviously, we have the city council meeting on May the 9th. The roundtable, the business roundtable is May the 14th at the Quarter Path Rec Center. Planning Commission on the 15th. We have the Tourism Development Grant Review Committee on May the 24th. And then on the 27th is Memorial Day, and city offices will be closed.
Thank you. This takes us to the open forum portion of our meeting, where we invite any visitors here to come and address council on any topic. I do have one speaker's card, Mr. Gary Shelley. And Mr. Shelley, I know you know this, so this is for everybody else's benefit. When you come forward again, if you could offer your name and address, and please keep your remarks to 5 minutes or less. Welcome, Mr. Shelley.
Well, thank you very much. I am Gary Shelley. I live at 205 Indian Springs Road. I have a prepared statement here. But before I begin, I would like to thank Mr. Lewis for your presentation. I found it one of the more interesting ones that I've attended, heard. And I would like to point out to the council, quick mathematics, at $2,000 per person in federal funds and 8,000 William and Mary students here in town, $16 million per year over the next 10 years, just for the presence of having those students in this town. Just saying. Last week, one of my neighbors called 911 for assistance, as she has done many times over the years. She's a remarkable woman. She's an octogenarian. She's physically strong. She's able. She has sharp of mind, and she's sharp of intellect. But life has dealt her challenges most of us would likely find too overbearing to deal with. She is the primary caregiver of both her daughter, who is roughly my age, but physically disabled, and her grandson, a 35-year-old man who is nonverbal and has severe special needs. This remarkable woman devotes every ounce of her energy to the care of her family, and always without complaint. In this particular instance, 2 college students who were walking down the street immediately came to her aid, and the situation was resolved before the ambulance arrived. I happened upon the scene shortly afterward, and she asked me to tell the college students that they were her heroes. All of our neighbors are aware of her situation, and all of our neighbors are willing to help when necessary. This is what community is all about. I thought long and hard whether or not to say what I'm about to say next. It brings me no pleasure. but it needs to be said. I say it with exasperation and disgust. Community is not about exclusion. Unfortunately, some residents in neighborhoods close to the college have voiced objections to having college students live amongst them. These residents, though small in number, have succeeded in persuading former city councils to enact policies that are clearly aimed at limiting student presence in the downtown neighborhoods. These residents are very well organized. One resident in particular has been able to successfully foment anti-student sentiment. He has had an outsized influence on council over the years. He has been quick to proclaim his close friendships with council members and top-level city staff. He has made numerous complaints against students, mostly trivial matters, often meritless, such as where students park on his street or students stepping onto his lawn. In 2003, he spoke in open forum and infamously referred to students as a cancer in his neighborhood, alleging loud and drunken behavior on their part. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black. Fast forward to April of 2017, when this individual was arrested at his residence for, among other things, disorderly conduct, public intoxication, swearing, and trespassing on a neighbor's property. At his trial, the prosecutor charged that during his arrest, he, in a very loud voice, made references to, and I quote, effing college students in his neighborhood. Not just college students, mind you, but effing college students, revealing exactly how he feels about them. Judge Killalea rendered a remarkably harsh judgment, calling his actions petty and imposed not only a monetary fine and 50 hours of community service, but most importantly, an extraordinary order for him to have no contact with his across-the-street neighbor, nor to set foot on her property. Never have I heard of such unneighborly behavior by a student. It is important that this individual's behavior be called out. He has been the leader of the powerful West Williamsburg Heights neighborhood group. His influence on council over the years is unmistakable and it is undeniable. I present this not for the purpose of defaming anyone. That would serve no purpose. But to encourage you, our council, to re-examine the rightful place of college students in this community, to recognize the shameful and exclusionary attitudes toward students by some of our citizens, and to acknowledge council's failure to maximize our city's potential when it favors the self-interest of a small group of residents. College students, after all, are our most valuable asset and as deserving of inclusion in our neighborhoods as anyone else. For the betterment of Williamsburg, you must get this right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shelley. Would anybody else like to address council? Seeing no one, we'll close the open forum. Do we have any items for closed session? Do I hear a motion?
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
Ms. Bertram?
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Freiling?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Mr. Zhang?
Aye.
We are adjourned. We will reconvene.